that was the implied. And then it became almost the only place where one could be schooled if you were black or African American. And then you saw where the progression of historically black colleges and universities took hold, and they started to shape and reshape during a period of time, the 60s and the 70s, and literally into the 80s as well. And now there's, since the 90s and the 2000s, there's been a resurgence or reemergence of the historically black college and university experience. And it's not just students, although many, who are coming from places like New England, who are going to these institutions, but it's also people who have gone to those institutions who are finding their way back to supporting those institutions as well. And so, again, not everyone has the answer, but when you think about the contributions of historically black colleges, not just to you personally and how you've been edified through that experience, but what are you seeing? What is your perspective of today's historically black college or university? Dr. Friedman?
Since I recently graduated, like this will be my 5th year out, what I saw, and because I went to predominantly white institutions and then going to a historical college, I want to interject too. My grandfather actually went to Tuskegee for cabinetry and then was drafted for World War II and was on one of the ships that were targeted for the bombing. And he wound up, because it's segregated then, they could only be cooks. But he had to arm the machine, but he was able to witness the peace treaty that President Theodore Roosevelt signed. And I wouldn't find that until I told him I was going to Alabama A&M University. And that's how he met my grandmother through a church event. And they're from Illinois, so you know it's interesting. But from my perspective, what I've been seeing, you have 2 types of institutions which were mentioned in the video. One is predominantly white institutions push research, publish, perish mindset, and money, while traditionally colleges that we attended, they were given money from the government and subsidized. So now they're catching up with having to compete in a world where there's so much advanced education in an institution like this. And then secondly, what's not being talked about a lot is that your historically colleges that we're attending, the minority are white people or Caucasians. So there's already universities in Virginia that are predominantly white now. They're no longer historically black colleges. And we don't talk about those things. You're going up against a segregated caste system of tradition. And we need to remember that Booker T. Washington, his mother was raped by a white man. And he was obsessed in trying to identify with a father figure. And he clinged to the general there. So I think if you look at the construct of his identity, he didn't really have one. And the only thing he appreciated and he was admired was that. So from my perspective, there's still a lot to go forward. And I'm looking at it from a graduate perspective. And this kind of came around in the 1993 era. And secondly, when I was in grad school, it was international. There weren't people that looked like me trying to get their PhDs or master's degrees. So then you had another type of racism. And that racism was like, why are you here? And I was like, well, my forefathers were either on the Indian reservation or a sharecropper trying to be free, but you forgot that the civil rights helps you benefit for you to come over here. And those are the discussions that need to be reminded in the history there, because at my institution you had Indian, Ethiopian, you had everything, and it was conveniently to say I'm African American, I'm the only token at events. But after that, they are like, I'm proud to be from this country. So when you have no identity in your own country, it's challenging. So that's my perspective.
Did you, are we to follow? You know,
If you care to.
this is difficult. Let me just say this.
Yep.
And I think your question was, would you repeat it?
So the question was, what do you see as the contributions today in terms of the historical Black
Thank you.
College University?
Thank you. Thank you very much. I think in today's world that those schools that you call historic Black colleges and universities, who used to be called colored, they help people develop character and worthwhileness and worthwhileness of self, that they become so inclusive of the world because they feel so good about themselves. And if without self-worth, you don't have much left. So all of the bantering and all the stuff that's going around, you've got to get to self first and the confidence, and you've got to be a prince or a princess in order to deal with the future. And I believe the school, my Johnson C. Smith University, is doing exactly that. With some. All? No, not necessarily. But I think they're pouring out numbers of people who are so strong and their character is being driven by inclusiveness.
So one of the things that Dr. Freeman mentioned was, she talked about Booker T. Washington. And one of the things that you saw in this piece was the Booker T. Washington stance on education or higher education, and then a little bit on Dr. W.B. Du Bois in terms of his piece. I would encourage you to further your understanding of these two positions. And in fact, very much in higher education history, but then also in Black thought and Black history, you will find these two people in the way that it was shared here, literally on either ends of the continuum. And if you, again, to further this just a little bit, so you heard Booker T. Washington talking about the use of hands, you know, so using your hands to develop the economic self. And there's the what's called the Atlanta Compromise. There's a speech that he gave at the, I believe it was the Atlanta Exposition, and it was called the Five Fingers Compromise. So do your homework on that.
Yeah, awesome.
On the other side, I'm surprised they didn't bring it up in this piece, but the whole philosophy that W.B. Du Bois, Dr. Du Bois, put forward was the talented 10th. And if you're not familiar with that, write that down. But the basic premise of his philosophy was that you needed about 10% of the African American population to be highly educated so that they could be the thinkers and the philosophers around democracy and freedom. And so the talented 10th. And actually a lot of what Dr. Du Bois put forward was the foreground for what then became known as the Black intelligentsia. So if for nothing else, I say that to make me sound smart as you ever want to believe it. You walk away and say, man, that moderator knew his stuff. But anyway, that's your homework. That is your homework. So I want to reserve some time for you to ask questions as well. But I'm going to pose one more question to this group and then turn it over to you to talk about the experience. So one of the things that we saw in this evolution of the historically Black college and university was this notion of activism. And then you couple that with Mr. Key's piece in talking about sort of self-development and self-fulfillment. What is the intersection, even today, between this notion of self-edification and activism? What do we see the role of HBCUs in really helping to promote democracy and equity and inclusivity in today's world?
I think HBCUs, what they do is create a great pride, self-pride, self-esteem, self-reliance, and from that, of course, breeds an activist type of mind, or something inside that churns that make you understand and know you have to do more, not just only for yourself, but for common man.
Right, okay.
And I think, for me personally, when I was in Talladega, I just became comfortable with being black. It was to the point where my nickname was Black. But it gave me a confidence that I could kind of do anything. And then I think if you're in a room with a bunch of people who think they can conquer the world, eventually you're going to try to conquer the world. And I think that's what happens at a blackout.
So what questions do you have for us? Yes.
Yeah, I'm extremely ignorant about this topic. I'm just wondering, I'm assuming that we have colleges and universities that are predominantly African American because of demographic and geographic factors. How they differ from an historically black college or university.
Oh, interesting. Okay. I have a response, but go ahead. So there are federal designations for, the short name is HSIs, Hispanic Serving Institutions, which means that you've met a threshold of 51% or more of your student demographic is that racial ethnic group. That is not so in terms of historically black colleges and universities. They were founded as HBCUs and they will remain by designation HBCUs. But to Dr. Friedman's point, there are several historically black colleges and universities, or HBCUs for short, that have increased their enrollments of white students over the last decade. A lot of that has to do with some of these institutions are public institutions, and so there has been this redefinition of what it means to be a public institution. The other has to relate to some of what you heard on the film about the struggle with enrollments, and so between international students and opening up to more students, then that has been the case. But to be very clear, even though these historically black colleges and universities were founded solely for blacks, they have always been open institutions, okay? So that's why they're named historically black, not necessarily exclusively black institutions, right? And also the other piece, you heard at the very beginning that many of the presidents were white men, and then you had some white women that were presidents in the case of Spelman. But their faculties, in many regards, have been in the latter, not decade, but in the latter probably 50 years or so, have actually been growingly more diverse, both from international ranks, but then also, I mean, think of the number of white professors that you had when, I don't know if you had many at Johnson C. Smith when you were there.
I did.
But there have always been white faculty at these universities.
And let me just say this. I was so impressed with the sharpness of the professors in my school who had gone to white institutions. And one of them was Dr., never forget his name, A.O. Steele, who says that eventually we're going to need a lot of white money. Well, just recently I got a note from my school that says the Bill Gates Foundation just gave us about 8 or 10 years of money to educate people, not just black or colored people, but people. And I'm elated. I am excited about that kind of contribution for people. And I think we need to keep talking about inclusion, because all of us are in this organic whole called human beings. We are one nation, one person, one human being, one, what do we call it? Human race. And we just got to keep driving toward that, to be inclusive and successful in this country, and at our homes, and our neighborhoods, and our relationships. And boy, the closer you get to them, the better, the more like you are.
Did that answer your question?
Yeah. And thank you for being here, everybody.
Oh, no, thank you for being here. Question?
When I listen, I try to balance the desire for inclusivity, obviously, balanced with the power of being a group of people who are similar to you, and the energy you receive from that. We have so many, I mean, we could have seen a movie about women's colleges, we could have seen a college about Jewish summer camps. It just goes on and on and on. And And what I try to reconcile is the need to have a beautifully inclusive mindset in your life about everything you see, the people you see, the sites you go to, but at the same time, the power of that identity of being around people who have similarities to you, and you breed energy out of that. And how do we sort of walk this line to say, it's okay, you know, I'm listening to you talk about inclusivity, but at the same time, there's power. I think many of us in this room have experienced it in different settings, whatever those settings are. But at the same time, never allowing us to get so absorbed in that lack of inclusivity, you know, that we distort how we look at the world, you know. So I guess my question ties to, how do you frame that, you know, in thinking about an institution that you go to that is predominantly of similar, you know, nature, and whatever, you can fill in the blank. This movie is about historically black colleges. We could have done any theme that way.
Yeah, and I'm sorry, I'm also struggling hearing about like that push for inclusivity and stuff when talking about HBCUs, because that seems like that's what the beauty is about these institutions.
So it's really interesting, and I'm going to take this one at a time, if you don't mind. So when I was in Arizona and we were planning, so I finished Tuskegee in 1991, and I've been an advocate for students to attend HBCUs where they didn't have an exposure to it at all. And we were planning an HBCU college tour. And I was asked by the newspaper, so why is it? What is that thing? And I think the benefit of the identity and the sense of purpose and the sense of self and that whole cultural, historical appreciation that comes from the group that looks like you. So pick it, right? The HBCU experience, the women's college experience, the Jewish camp experience, whatever it is. But there's a strength that comes, and Harvey said it, it's character. It's that strong sense of character, that strong sense of self. Early in the film, one of the historians said, HBCUs are unapologetically black. And it's the opportunity for brown people to be in an environment that uplifts and that strengthens and that empowers. And in that then comes the realization that outside of that environment, we can affect positive change. Because we identify and we empathize with everyone who feels that oppression or that difficulty or that struggle. And not having the benefit of the confidence, the empowerment, the sense of self, the history, the pride,